Beneath the night sky, there are moments of silence so deep that people once believed they belonged to the realm of the divine. Perfect circular orbits were taught for thousands of years as an unquestionable truth. Elegant, complete, beyond doubt. And then, at the very edge of that world, one man noticed something almost invisible. An error of 8 minutes. Not 8 years, not 8 centuries, just 8 minutes off from prediction. Yet that tiny discrepancy was enough to shake the entire cosmic picture humanity had long believed to be sacred and unchanging. And the man who dared to trust that error was neither a rebel nor a revolutionary. He was partially blind, poor, deeply devout, and spent his life believing that God did not create chaos. Only that human understanding had not yet gone deep enough. His name was Johannes Kepler. The story you are about to hear is not about a genius celebrated in his lifetime. It is the journey of a man who paid a price for truth, paid with time, paid with loneliness, and at times paid with the safety of his own family, amid war-plagued superstition and rigid dogma. Kepler quietly measured the heavens one number at a time, one night after another. He believed the universe had order, not the order of power or church authority, but an order written in mathematics, hidden beneath motions that appeared chaotic. If you have ever wondered why truth so often arrives late, why are those who see first often the ones who suffer most? Then this story is for you. Allow yourself to slow down for a moment. Take a deep breath and step with me into the sky of Johannes Kepler. If you love true stories told slowly, meant to be listened to at night, you may subscribe to the channel or leave a comment to share your thoughts. A gentle like or share also helps stories like this find more companions. And now we begin with a very small error that changed the way all of humanity looks up at the sky. Chapter 1. The 8-minute error, a small flaw that shook the universe. At the dawn of the 17th century, as Europe was being torn apart by religious division and endless war, one man sat hunched over a desk for 4 relentless years, trying to understand why Mars refused to follow the perfect circular path everyone believed it should. Outside his window lay Prague, the capital of the Holy Roman Empire, a city where astronomy, astrology, magic, and politics collided in a tangled aftermath of the Middle Ages. Inside, Johannes Kepler, a mathematician and astronomer, a Protestant believer once driven into exile, stared at a single number. 8 arc minutes. A discrepancy so small it seemed almost meaningless, yet powerful enough to keep him awake for years. In Kepler's time, it was universally accepted that planets moved in circles around the Earth or around the Sun, if one followed Copernicus. The circle in its absolute perfection was considered a sacred form, the only shape worthy of a universe created by God. But when Kepler used the extraordinarily precise observational data of Tycho Brahe, the Danish master of astronomical observation, to reconstruct the orbit of Mars, he discovered something unsettling. It did not fit. Not by much. only by 8 arc minutes, an angle no greater than the slight misstep of a minute hand on a clock. But to Kepler, it felt like an explosion. Kepler realized that if those 8 arc minutes could not be ignored, then the problem must lie in the theory, not in the data. At the time, this was almost unthinkable. The error was so small that most astronomers would have dismissed it or quietly adjusted the observations to preserve the model. But Kepler, stubborn and singular in spirit, chose the opposite path. He trusted the error. He believed that if the universe was truly built by God through mathematics, then it must be exact, allowing no mistake, not even the smallest one. And so began 4 years of repetition. Calculations revisited again and again. Every planetary position reconstructed, orbits drawn and redrawn on parchment. Until at last, for the first time in human history, he traced a curve no one had ever assigned to the heavens before. An ellipse. An ellipse resembles a stretched circle. Unlike a circle which has a single center, an ellipse has 2 focal points. And Kepler discovered that the orbit of Mars was not a circle at all, but an ellipse with the Sun occupying one of those 2 foci. From this insight emerged what we now call Kepler's first law. The planets move around the Sun in elliptical orbits, with the Sun at one focus. All of it born from a mistake of 8 minutes. But he did not stop there. As he followed this orbit more closely, Kepler noticed something else just as unsettling. The planet did not move at a constant speed. When it drew nearer to the Sun, it moved faster. When it drifted farther away, it slowed down. This too defied a tradition that had endured for thousands of years. From this insight emerged the second law. A line connecting a planet to the Sun sweeps out equal areas in equal intervals of time. Put simply, a planet accelerates and decelerates depending on its distance from the Sun, a form of celestial motion that had never before been applied to the heavens. These discoveries sent shock waves through European astronomy, not only because they were correct, but because they brought an end to a worldview. Stretching from Aristotle to Ptolemy, a worldview that held the heavens to be a realm of perfection, governed by unchanging circles and uniform motion. For Kepler, the universe was no longer a stage for elegant circular dances arranged by divine aesthetics. It became a mechanism that could be understood through laws, mathematics, and careful observation. He once said that even God must be verified through mathematics. The world around him was unforgiving. Kepler lived amid religious chaos as Protestantism and Catholicism struggled across Europe as the 30 Years' War loomed on the horizon, and as astronomy remained entangled with astrology theology and ancient sacred symbols. To claim that planets did not move in circles was to many no different from saying the heavens themselves could lie. Yet Kepler was not merely dismantling an astronomical theory. He was dismantling an entire way of seeing the world, the belief that cosmic order was absolute, immutable, and beyond question. In its place, he offered something quieter and more radical. That order was still sacred, but it could be read like a piece of music if one was willing to listen to the smallest deviations. and listening came at a cost. 4 years for a single law. Reputation lost among traditionalists. Peace of mind shattered by constant religious persecution, forcing him to flee from Graz to Prague and later to Linz. What he gained, however, was something humanity had never possessed before. A precise model capable of predicting planetary motion, a foundation upon which Newton would later build celestial mechanics. An error of 8 arc minutes to most people was a trivial detail. In Kepler's hands, it became the first crack in the smooth glass surface of the classical universe. A tiny fracture, but enough for the light of truth to pass through. This was the price of truth. A kind of unwavering persistence that borders on blindness. Yet because of it, Kepler did more than redraw the heavens. He made them understandable. Kepler was not born to be an astronomer. He was a sickly child with poor eyesight, raised amid superstition and war, a life few expected to survive, let alone change the way humanity looked at the sky. But perhaps it was precisely because he had grown up seeing the world through a blur that he never ignored the smallest deviation. Kepler's vision was never clear yet. Those very eyes saw what no one else could. Chapter 2. The Nearsighted Boy of the Village. In a small village in Swabia in southern Germany, the winter of 1571 arrived with ice and silence. Inside a timber house with mud-packed walls, a premature child was born bluish and so fragile that few believed he would survive the night. Johannes Kepler entered the world amid the cold and the hushed whispers of neighbors. No one imagining that this child would one day change how humanity understands the sky. Kepler did not grow up like other children. He contracted smallpox early in life, leaving his eyesight so poor that he could not clearly see his father's face, even when the man sat directly across from him. Weak vision kept him from chasing games in the yard, and from gazing at the stars the way others did when they looked up at night. Yet it was those same blurred, imperfect eyes that led him into another world, one where he learned to imagine what he could not see clearly. Kepler's father was a mercenary, a man who seemed to live by bloodshed and wages alone. He was often absent, and one day he vanished entirely. No one knew whether he was alive or dead. Kepler's mother, Katharina, belonged to a very different world. She knew herbs treated illnesses with roots and whispered words. In the village, people half believed in her and half feared her. Some called her a witch, others owed her their lives. For Kepler, the smells of acrid smoke-dried roots hanging from the rafters, and his mother's lullabies tender, yet filled with mystery, were simply part of childhood. The poverty of the Kepler household was not only a lack of food or clothing. It was also a distance from knowledge itself. In an age when books were still a privilege of the wealthy, Kepler learned only what the local church could offer. Even so, he stood apart. A shy, sickly child who liked to draw shapes in the dirt and ask questions no one wanted to answer. When Kepler was 6, a comet appeared. The entire village gathered in the fields to watch. To many, it was an omen of disaster, a sign of war, death, or plague. Kepler, despite his poor eyesight, faintly saw a long streak of light, like a silver thread stretched across the sky. Years later, he recalled that moment as a shiver running through him. Not fear, but something else entirely. For the first time, he sensed that the sky was moving. It was not still. It was saying something. A year later, Kepler witnessed a solar eclipse, this time reflected on the surface of water. As the adults rushed to the river to watch the sun darken, he followed. He could not see clearly, but he felt the light dim, the wind shift, the birds fall silent. He remembered the sensation precisely. The sky was not quiet. The sky was whispering. From that moment on, the heavens were no longer a meaningless canopy hung overhead. They were alive, and they followed the laws. As Kepler grew older, his sense of being out of place only deepened. At school, he was not strong enough to fight, not fast enough for games, and far too shy to make friends easily. Yet he possessed a strangely powerful memory, and he was drawn to patterns others ignored. The measurements of rooftops, the cycles of planting and harvest, the rhythm of the church bells. He copied everything into a small notebook, convinced that if he were patient enough, the world would eventually open itself to him. In a society where faith in God coexisted with fear of magic, Kepler learned how to walk a narrow line. At home, his mother taught him how to boil roots and listen to the wind. At school, his teachers taught him scripture and Latin. These opposing worlds did not confuse him. Instead, they led him to believe that a deeper order might connect them both. An invisible order, but one that could be understood if a person listened closely enough. It was a time of upheaval. Late 16th century Europe was submerged in crisis. Plague swept through villages. Failed harvests sent the price of barley soaring. And above all, the Protestant Reformation was splitting Christianity into two opposing camps, Catholic and Protestant. In many places, what you believed could decide whether you lived or died. Within this world, a poor boy, the son of an herbalist, mother, and a mercenary father, grew up on the margins of both belief and power. From that ground, from those imperfect eyes, from a childhood marked by scarcity and loneliness, Kepler learned his first great lesson. That sometimes what we do not see clearly is precisely what is most worth pursuing. And that blur is not a limitation, but an invitation to look deeper. Years later, after he had become a renowned astronomer, Kepler would describe the human mind as a flame forever hungry for knowledge. He wrote that imagination is a treasure without end, and that nature is an infinite book for those who know how to read it. He also once wrote, "Skybound was the mind, earthbound the body rests." In those words we glimpse his spirit, not eyes that saw everything clearly, but a mind that never stopped pursuing truth, even when it meant pushing against superstition, illness, and prejudice. Perhaps he had already begun to understand this in childhood. When a comet cut across the sky, when darkness swallowed the sun, when the world appeared only as scattered signs waiting to be pieced together. Nothing Kepler witnessed was ever truly clear, but clarity was never what he needed. He needed only a reason to believe that order existed within chaos. And he believed, very early on. Chapter 3. Schoolrooms, Scripture, and a Strange New Universe. When Kepler was 18, Germany was fragmented into more than 300 small states and territories, each with its own laws, its own faith, its own ruler. Amid this patchwork of power, the Church remained the only institution capable of bringing a poor child close to books. Kepler received a scholarship from the Duchy of Württemberg, a rare program designed to support gifted students and train them as Protestant ministers. It was the only path by which a poor boy, the son of an herbalist woman, suspected of witchcraft, could touch the world of academic knowledge. Leaving his small village behind, Kepler entered the seminary carrying an extraordinary memory, a tireless curiosity, and a frail body shaped by illness. The school stood in Tübingen, an old university town in Swabia, with gently curved red-tiled roofs, uneven cobblestone streets worn by wagon wheels, and the Neckar River flowing quietly along the edge of the old city. On misty mornings, church bells echoed through the cold, damp air, mingling with the low murmur of lectures drifting from wooden-framed windows. The atmosphere was always tinged with the scent of old paper ink and wood ash, a bittersweet mixture of knowledge, poverty, and discipline. At school, Kepler studied everything: scripture, Latin, philosophy, mathematics, elementary astronomy. Yet something unexpected happened. It was precisely within these rigid classrooms, where the Word of God was treated as absolute, that Kepler began to hear notes that did not quite align. The teacher who shaped him most deeply was Michael Maestlin, a professor of mathematics and theology. Outwardly, Maestlin adhered to the geocentric model, with Earth fixed at the center of the cosmos. Inwardly, however, he quietly supported Copernicus, the man who had proposed a heliocentric universe, with the sun at its center. At the time, this was a dangerous idea, one that challenged both scripture and a tradition stretching back thousands of years. Maestlin did not teach Copernicus openly. He hinted instead. Through an exercise, a marginal note, a raised eyebrow when Kepler asked the right question. For Kepler, these subtle signals were enough to open an entire universe. He began to wonder, if the sun stood at the center, then the sacred order he had trusted all his life would have to be rewritten from the beginning. To Kepler, the Copernican system was not merely a mathematical model. It was a theological expression. He believed that God in his omnipotence must have constructed the universe through pure mathematics. And if that were true, then nothing could be more sacred than seeking to understand that structure using the very tools God had left behind. Theorems, functions, geometry. From his earliest days as a student, Kepler wrote down a conviction that would never leave him. The universe, he believed, was a living image of God. He began sketching strange models, nested polyhedra, concentric circles in motion, musical ratios mapped onto the distances between planets. While others studied to become ministers, Kepler became absorbed in understanding how God had written the world, not in prayer alone, but in geometry. That pursuit filled him with both exhilaration and solitude. Most of his classmates had little interest in mathematics. They studied in order to preach. Kepler wanted to explain the universe itself through reason. Where others prayed to grasp the will of God, Kepler reached for ruler and compass, convinced that if he measured with enough precision, he might touch the mind of the Creator. Here again he found himself pulled between two worlds, faith and reason, scripture and equations. Yet instead of choosing one over the other, Kepler believed they were not in conflict at all. They were two entrances to the same temple. And only by walking through both could one hope to understand what was truly sacred. In his final years at the University of Tübingen, Kepler was nominated to continue his studies and become a minister. Then unexpectedly, an offer arrived. A position as a teacher of mathematics and astronomy at a Protestant school in Graz, Austria. It was a turning point. He left the seminary, he left the sermons, and he stepped into a life of orbits, star tables, and a journey no one could have predicted. What he carried with him was not memorized scripture, but a deeper conviction that anything truly sacred could be tested. That if the universe was indeed written in the language of God, then that language was mathematics, and he would learn to read it. He did not yet know that in Graz, a place he had chosen simply to earn a living, he would write a book so strange that it would draw the attention of the scholarly world. A book no one had asked for, no one was waiting for, yet one that would open the path Kepler would follow for the rest of his life. Chapter 4. God's Universe, written in geometry. Graz was a quiet town on the southern edge of the Habsburg Empire. Dark green hills rose behind its gray medieval walls. Monasteries and church schools lay half-hidden beneath thin morning mist, while church bells marked the hours like somber reminders of an order no one was meant to question. Faith ruled both lecture halls and market squares. And it was here in a place that seemed defined by little more than cobbled alleys and gently curved red-tiled roofs that a young man began quietly questioning the entire universe. Johannes Kepler arrived in Graz at the age of 23, not as a scientist, but as a recent graduate of theological studies from Tübingen. His original path had been toward becoming a Protestant minister. Yet instead of continuing on to preach the Word of God, Kepler accepted a position teaching mathematics and astronomy at a local Protestant school, largely because he needed work. To him, Graz was meant to be temporary. A stop along the way, a means of survival before he could decide what to do next. But destiny often hides inside the most ordinary arrangements. Kepler's primary duty was to write calendars. Not simple household calendars, but astrological ones, a curious blend of astronomy and predictions of fortune, weather, harvests, and even war. These calendars were immensely popular, especially among nobles and merchants, and Kepler was expected to produce one every year. To many, they were little more than superstition dressed in numbers. To Kepler, they offered a rare chance to use mathematics to approach the motion of the heavens, and through that motion to reflect on the will of the Creator. By day, he taught classes, wrote calendars, and worried about making ends meet. By night, in a small rented room lit by a flickering lamp, he drew not landscapes or portraits, but circles, spheres, and geometric solids nested inside one another like a cosmic labyrinth. On his worn wooden desk, sheets of parchment lay crowded with measurements, ratios, and notes in Latin. To an outsider, they might have looked like the strange games of a dreamer lost in abstraction. Kepler was following an intuition no one before him had seriously pursued. The distances between the planets were not random, but arranged according to perfect geometric solids. 5 classical shapes, known to the Greeks as the Platonic solids: the cube, the tetrahedron, the octahedron, the dodecahedron, the icosahedron. Kepler placed each solid between 2 spheres like shells separating planetary orbits. Each planet lay on its own sphere. The spacing between them was decoded through sacred geometry itself. It was a model at once strange and mesmerizingly beautiful, a vision of the cosmos ordered by form and proportion, and yet it rested on no experimental proof at all. He called it Mysterium Cosmographicum, the mystery of the cosmos. It was not a scientific work by modern standards, but a kind of geometric poem where faith and mathematics came together to write a manuscript no one had ever attempted before. For Kepler, this was not an act of imagination. He truly believed that God had created the universe through geometry, not for artistic beauty alone, but for reasons profound enough that the human mind could in time uncover them. These solid forms were not symbols. They were traces left behind by the hand of creation itself. To Kepler, reading the universe through geometry was as sacred as prayer. When he completed the first draft, Kepler sent it to his former teacher Michael Maestlin, the man who had first introduced him to Copernicus. Maestlin responded with caution. He corrected a few calculations and advised Kepler to temper his emotions, to mix less theology into scientific models. But Kepler was not discouraged. He continued sending the manuscript to other scholars, including Tycho Brahe, the most renowned astronomer in Europe at the time. Tycho did not accept Copernicus's heliocentric system, and he was even less convinced by Kepler's sacred polyhedra. Yet as he read the manuscript, he recognized something unmistakable: a deep hunger to understand the universe through logic and observation. A young man with no observatory of his own, armed only with intuition and mathematics, had built a model that was incomplete, even flawed, but carried within it the seed of something far greater. Mysterium Cosmographicum was published in 1596. It did not shake the academic world, but it was strange enough to be noticed. For Kepler, it marked a beginning, a voice still faint but now audible among greater names. Few truly understood his model, yet no one could deny this. A young man without an observatory, without reputation, was trying to read the universe through geometry. Graz remained quiet. Kepler continued teaching writing calendars and laboring over his private calculations. But he was no longer entirely alone. Letters began to arrive from scholars, including Tycho Brahe himself. Faint signals from a wider intellectual universe beyond the town's walls. The door to European science had begun to open. Kepler did not yet know that only a year later, forces beyond his control would compel him to leave Graz. For now, in a small room crowded with parchment and hand-drawn polyhedra, he believed he was moving in the right direction, even if the path before him had not yet been named. Chapter 5. Exile and the Beginning of Destiny. Amid thousands of numbers, star charts and calculations that stretched deep into the night, Kepler also lived another life entirely. A family life. In 1597, just as Mysterium Cosmographicum was completed, he married Barbara Müller, the daughter of a fairly prosperous local merchant, a widow with 2 children of her own. It was not a marriage born of sweeping romance, but one shaped by circumstance, practicality, and perhaps a quiet hope for a stable home within a personal life long marked by absence and uncertainty. Barbara was strong-willed, grounded, and belonged to a very different world, one where money status and social order determined everything. Kepler, by contrast, continued to wander inwardly among sacred polyhedra and equations no one else understood. They lived together not easily, not glamorously, yet in those early, relatively calm days, their small household became an anchor for a man who had always felt himself standing at the edge of society. Soon after the wedding, they moved into a modest house on the outskirts of the city. Within that domestic space were the cries of children mixed with the scratching of quill on parchment. Kepler continued writing astrological calendars, continued teaching, and continued believing that the world could be understood through geometry. But beyond the walls of that home, darkness was gathering. Europe was entering a period of intensified religious purges. Across many territories of the Holy Roman Empire, Catholic princes began tightening their grip on Protestant lands. In Styria, where Kepler lived and taught, Archduke Ferdinand, a staunch Catholic, issued decrees ordering all who refused to convert to leave. Protestant schools were shut down. Teachers were forced either to recant their faith or to go into exile. By late 1599, as religious tensions escalated, Kepler began quietly searching for a way out. He wrote to Tycho Brahe, the renowned astronomer who had recently been summoned by Emperor Rudolf II to Prague. Tycho, an eccentric Danish nobleman with a metal prosthetic nose, a man who once fought a duel over a disputed calculation, was in the process of building a new observatory and possessed the most accurate planetary data in Europe. Then unexpectedly, Brahe replied. The letter was not warm, not friendly. Just a few brief lines, vague references to the possibility of collaboration. But to Kepler, it felt like a thin beam of light piercing a darkened sky. In early 1600, the expulsion order was formally enacted in Graz. The remaining Protestants were given a choice: convert or leave the region. There would be no negotiation, no delay. For Kepler, this was not merely the loss of a job. He was being forced to leave behind his new home, his students, his acquaintances, even the fragile beginnings of recognition earned through Mysterium Cosmographicum. Barbara had a dowry, but in a tightly monitored Catholic society, a Protestant scientist was someone no one dared to shelter. Amid the anxiety and pressure of the decree, Kepler understood that there was no path left behind him. But this time he did not retreat into obscurity. He had a destination. The reply from Prague had opened a narrow passage, and Kepler chose to step through it. Before leaving Graz, he wrote once more to Brahe, making his intention clear. He would come to Prague. He asked for a meeting in person, and he emphasized one crucial truth. His model needed data, and Brahe was the man who possessed it. Not long after, Tycho sent a formal invitation. It was not an honorific summons, but a practical proposal. Tycho needed a calculator. Kepler needed data to test his ideas. And so, in the spring of that year, Kepler and Barbara quietly packed their belongings. Books, mathematical instruments, a few surviving models, and their young child. They left Graz behind. This time, it was not only exile imposed from outside, it was also a choice, a step toward a future he could not yet see clearly, but one he felt compelled to pursue. The decision was heavy with uncertainty. Kepler had never met Brahe. He had heard the rumors of a volatile temperament, of aristocratic pride, of a man who guarded his data like personal treasure. But Kepler had few alternatives. He had no observatory, no academy, no homeland. The only thing he possessed was a hunger to read what he called the language of God. And he knew that he needed the numbers Brahe held. To an outsider, the journey might have seemed like a gamble. To Kepler, it felt like destiny. He did not yet know that the numbers Tycho had guarded for a lifetime would lead to discoveries that would reshape the history of astronomy. But everything would begin here, with the carriage leaving Graz in silence, and with an unshakable faith that a deeper order existed within a chaotic world. And then amid the rains of June, among moss-covered castles and the golden domes of Prague, Kepler would knock on the door of Tycho Brahe's residence. He would arrive carrying a mind few understood and a longing few believed in. There, two men, two worlds, two powerful selves would collide and together begin writing the strangest year in the history of European astronomy. Chapter 6. A Fated Pair. Tycho and Kepler. Prague in the summer of 1600 was a city both ancient and strange. Its cobblestone streets were worn smooth by carriage wheels. Gothic towers rose beside Baroque facades. Golden domes gleamed next to castles darkened by moss and age. The city formed a fortress of power, art, and knowledge. In the heavy, humid air of Central Europe, church bells, mingled with winds sweeping through spires echoing across a skyline thick with the smoke of religious incense and alchemical experiments. This was not merely the political capital of the Holy Roman Empire. It was a crossroads of eccentric ideas, where Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler were about to enter a single year of collaboration and collision. Prague had drawn some of the most unusual minds in Europe. Its ruler, Emperor Rudolf II, was himself an anomaly. He was fascinated by astrology, devoted to science, a patron of alchemists, and a protector of astronomers, even those viewed with suspicion by the Church. This chaotic mixture made the city a fertile ground for knowledge and the perfect stage for one of the strangest partnerships in the history of science. Tycho Brahe was unlike any astronomer who had come before him. He laid the foundations of modern astronomy not through speculation, but through data. Born into Danish nobility, Brahe possessed the authority and pride of a Renaissance aristocrat. Yet what truly set him apart was his obsession with observing the heavens at a level of precision never before achieved. In the 2 decades before meeting Kepler, Brahe had recorded thousands of planetary and stellar positions using angular instruments and sighting devices, all before the telescope became a common astronomical tool. He constructed massive observational instruments fitted with intricate optical guides and carefully crafted metal measuring arcs. Night after night he stood beneath the sky recording the positions of Mars, Venus, Jupiter, and countless other bodies with an accuracy no one could rival. Brahe embodied pure observation, seeing with the eye, recording by hand, tracking the heavens through measurement. He did not entirely reject Copernicus, but he refused to accept a fully heliocentric system unless the data demanded it. For Brahe, observation must always lead theory. Kepler, by contrast, belonged to a different world. He owned no observatory, had no sophisticated instruments, and did not even have a circle of colleagues with whom he could exchange ideas regularly. But he possessed something far rarer: a deep mathematical intuition and an unshakable faith that the universe was a structure that could be understood through numbers. Kepler believed the heavens were not composed solely of perfect circles, as Aristotle had once described, or as generations of scholars had imagined. He believed that planetary motion could be decoded through laws, not merely through concentric circles or sacred symbols. Yet his theories lacked one crucial element: precise observational data. Kepler met Tycho Brahe at the stone villa in Banatki nad Jezero, not far from Prague. The building resembled a Renaissance scientific fortress granted to Tycho by Emperor Rudolf II for the establishment of his new observatory. Thick stone walls carried the scent of dampness. Wooden staircases creaked as they led up to domed observing platforms. From the very beginning, both men sensed that this would not be an easy relationship. Tycho was a nobleman. Kepler was a commoner. Tycho commanded observatory servants and imperial funding. Kepler brought ideals manuscripts no one had yet read and failing eyesight. Tycho was accustomed to giving orders. Kepler was not skilled at enduring authority. And more importantly, each carried his own ambition. Tycho sought to assert power through data. Kepler sought to reach the essence of the universe through models. Tycho was the observer holding the raw material. Every recorded planetary position, every meticulous note of celestial motion. He trusted reality numbers and the act of seeing before explaining. Kepler was the interpreter. He believed that within those numbers lay a profound mathematical law, and that by decoding it, he could pull back the veil of astronomy itself. Those differences often ignited arguments. Their workspace was constantly filled with sound. The scratch of Latin on parchment, the tapping of pens, the crackle of candles, the wind pressing against the windows, and above all, the sharp energy of debate. Students and assistants stood nearby, watching two men at once, conducting a historic dialogue and colliding again and again, intuition against reality. When night fell, Prague slipped into darkness. The windows of the observatory glowed like torches turned upward toward a sky dense with stars. Tycho sat with his deep-set eyes fixed on tables of data, never abandoning his principle. Data was sacred, and yet he slowly came to see that even sacred numbers needed someone who could listen to them. Kepler was that person. Living and working together for a year under such pressure and expectation was never easy. They gathered around star charts day and night, arguing, debating, erasing, and redrawing every curve. The star-filled nights over Prague with wind moving through ancient towers bore witness to thousands of calculations, thousands of lines of notes, and countless doubts raised and examined. While Brahe continued to supervise every observation with his sharp eye, Kepler plunged into the search for mathematical law hidden within the numbers. They walked the corridors, discussing details. They stood before tables of figures, hunting for patterns. And each time Kepler proposed a hypothesis, Brahe answered with a challenge. There were moments when Kepler came close to surrendering from exhaustion. Yet whenever he looked again at Brahe's numbers, he saw something beautiful. Not merely data, but an unplayed symphony. A moving picture that mathematics could in time translate. Brahe provided the data. Kepler tested it against every model, every possibility. Still no final answer emerged. It was a year of thorns, a year of collision between intuition and logic, between numbers and meaning. And in that collision, their fates became entwined. One great astronomical career drew toward its end, and a new chapter in science quietly began. Chapter 7. The Reluctant Heir. Kepler sat motionless before pages of unfinished numbers. On the desk, candlelight flickered, casting shadows across his face. Worn, hollowed. And yet his eyes still burned with a light no one could quite name. Beyond the half-closed wooden door lay an entire observatory. But tonight there were no hurried footsteps, no familiar voice of Tycho Brahe echoing through the stone corridors. The master of this place was gone, and the one who remained, the man who had never wished to stand in that position, now faced a truth that could not be avoided. Every data set, every responsibility, every unanswered question had fallen upon him. In October of 1601, Tycho Brahe died after a sudden illness only days after appearing at a royal banquet. The death came too quickly. Some whispered of poisoning. Others spoke of a far stranger, caused the result of a habit of refusing to relieve himself too long. A legend both bizarre and oddly fitting for Tycho's stubborn nature. Modern analyses have found no evidence of poison. Yet the rumors linger, clinging to his name as stubbornly as his fame. Kepler had worked with him for barely more than a year. their relationship tense and abrasive, yet charged with creative force, had not been given time to mature. And suddenly, everything Tycho left behind the observatory, the manuscripts, the assistants, and most importantly, the immense treasury of planetary data, now rested in Kepler's hands. He would later call it a heavy inheritance. Tycho had named no successor, but there was no one else capable of taking his place. And only days after the funeral, Emperor Rudolf II issued a decree. Johannes Kepler was appointed imperial mathematician, the very post Tycho had once held. The decision was swift and decisive, as though the emperor had seen something in Kepler that Kepler himself had not yet dared to trust. The title was more than recognition. It was protection. Amid suspicious glances from Tycho's former associates, amid quiet schemes to divide the precious data the appointment gave Kepler, the right to remain to continue the work and to keep the entire archive under his control. But legitimacy carried its own weight. And with it, the pressure became unmistakably real. The hardest task was not inheriting the data. It was inheriting the life's work of a man who did not share his beliefs. Tycho, meticulous and brilliant, as he was believed in his own model of the cosmos, Earth stood motionless at the center. The sun revolved around it, and the other planets revolved around the sun. It was a compromise balanced carefully between Copernicus and ancient tradition. Kepler did not believe in that model. Ever since his years in Tübingen, he had leaned toward heliocentrism. He believed the sun stood at the center not only of the planetary system, but of the sacred order God had designed. Yet now, to test that belief, he was forced to work with data gathered by a man who did not accept it. It was a bitter paradox. To prove Tycho wrong, Kepler had to rely entirely on Tycho's life's work. The months following Tycho's death were chaotic. Former assistants, men like Longomontanus, refused to accept an outsider like Kepler in command. They saw him as a dreamy mathematician unworthy of inheriting the legacy of a great observer. Some quietly copied portions of the data, hoping to build their own reputations. Kepler, lacking power status or lineage, possessed only one thing: a conviction that he could discern a deeper order hidden within the numbers. Amid this uncertainty, he began a task that even Tycho himself had never completed: reconstructing the planetary orbits, starting with the most difficult of all, Mars. Mars was a troublesome planet. It refused to follow the neat circular paths ancient astronomers had drawn. Tycho's data on the red planet was the most detailed in the entire solar system. And precisely because of that, it was the most unforgiving. It exposed discrepancies that every old model failed to resolve. Kepler plunged into analysis. Hundreds of pages of calculations, hundreds of hypotheses, hundreds of small errors forced him to begin again from the start. He tried circles, then offset circles, then layered combinations of models. Still no answer emerged. Outside Prague was sliding toward instability. Factions within the imperial court were fracturing. Religious war flickered across the continent. But inside a narrow room, Kepler remained fixed on a single question. Could planetary motion be described by an entirely new kind of geometry? On cold winter nights, as wind howled through stone-framed windows, Kepler sat amid piles of papers, a thin coat draped over his shoulders, his eyes burning from sleeplessness. He did not yet know that within a few years from this tangled mass of data and from a discrepancy that seemed almost trivial, he would uncover the first law of planetary motion. For now he was only an unwelcome heir bent over numbers no one else wanted to face. Chapter 8. Curved Orbits and the First Law. The night was dense like a black cloth without a single tear. Inside the observatory room there was only the sound of curling paper and the dry scratch of ink beneath a quill. Kepler no longer knew how many days and nights he had remained awake. He knew only this. If he set the pen down for even a moment, the fragile logic holding everything together might dissolve like the Prague mist beyond the walls. This was no longer a simple inquiry. It had become a battle. A battle between data and prejudice, between cold numbers and the burning ideas inside a human mind. Kepler understood that what lay before him was not merely a collection of tables and figures, but a doorway into an entirely new way of seeing the cosmos. For centuries, astronomers had believed that planets moved in circles, the perfect shapes sanctified by Aristotle and upheld by millennia of astronomical tradition. The circle was order. The circle was heaven. But Tycho Brahe's data told a different story. More precise than any observations ever recorded, spanning years of careful measurement. These numbers demanded trust beyond any untested assumption. Kepler began with Mars, the most troublesome of all the planets. Its large eccentricity made it uniquely revealing. Any mismatch between theory and reality appeared here first sharp and undeniable. He turned the pages of data again and again, comparing each position across time, binding every point with mathematics. A single small error could collapse an entire model. And that small error, Kepler realized, was not a flaw in the data. It was a signal pointing toward a deeper truth. He tested what he called the vicarious hypothesis, an adjusted circular model, carefully tuned to approximate the observations. It worked in fragments. At certain moments, it aligned. At others, especially when Mars approached the Sun, it failed completely. The conclusion became unavoidable. The orbit was not a circle. Then, as if a hidden path had emerged in the darkness, a curve he had once dismissed as too simple to be true came into view. Kepler saw it clearly at last. The true path of Mars was an ellipse. In a moment that seemed to stretch beyond time, he grasped the final implication. The Sun was not at the center of the orbit. It lay at one of the ellipse's two foci. That slight displacement the center shifted into a focus explained every observed change in position. Not a circle, but an ellipse. With that realization, Kepler shattered the last classical assumption. This was his first law. a description utterly opposed to the eternal perfect circles that philosophers had long worshipped as the image of heaven itself. But Kepler did not stop there. He pressed deeper, asking a more demanding question. If the orbit itself was uneven, did the planet's speed obey a law as well? He returned to the data with a different gaze, no longer focused solely on position, but on how velocity changed across small intervals of time. Then an idea surfaced with quiet force. If one draws a straight line connecting a planet to the sun, that line sweeps out equal areas in equal periods of time, no matter where the planet lies along its path. The implication was striking. A planet moves faster when it is closer to the sun and slower when it is farther away, a complete departure from the ancient assumption of uniform motion. This became the second law, a rule that described not just the shape of an orbit, but the rhythm of motion itself. As if each planet possessed its own breathing pattern, sometimes hurried, sometimes unhurried, governed by mathematics rather than chance. For years, Kepler recorded every calculation, every discrepancy, every small contradiction, then patiently resolved each one with a new law. His first and second laws were eventually published in Astronomia Nova in 1609, a work that not only explained the most difficult observations left behind by Tycho, but transformed how humanity understood the motion of every celestial body in the solar system. At the time, Europe's scientific climate was not yet fully prepared. Kepler's laws altered the very core of traditional astronomy, replacing graceful circles with bending ellipses. Yet it was precisely those curves that unlocked a far wider vision, one in which the universe was no longer static and idealized, but governed by deep order and open to understanding. When Kepler finally closed the book after another night of relentless work, the sky over Prague had begun to pale. Long rows of houses, bell towers and domes slowly emerged in the dim light of dawn, as if the city itself were waking after a long night, having silently witnessed the birth of laws that would change how all of humanity looks at the heavens. Chapter 9. A Winter of Loss. Prague in the years 1611 to 1612 was cold in more than just temperature. The city seemed to draw inward as political upheaval and disease swept across Europe. Cobblestone streets darkened under constant rain. Ancient domes gathered moisture in the air. Wind cut through the stone corridors of Prague Castle, chilling even the strongest bodies. But for Kepler, the cold went deeper still. The air outside was only a warning of the winter settling inside him. By then, Kepler was recognized as one of the greatest astronomers in Europe, standing at the height of his intellectual life, while his personal world began to collapse. As imperial mathematician, he continued to labor over endless astronomical data shaping harmonics. Mundi, the harmony of the world beneath fingers hardened by years of ink and calculation. Yet beyond the equations, another winter was approaching. One far colder than any Prague frost. In 1611, illness entered the Kepler household like a poisonous wind. Barbara Müller, the woman who had shared with him years of instability and exile, fell gravely ill. She suffered from what was known as Hungarian fever, followed by recurring seizures. Though she and Kepler had often differed in temperament, belief, and outlook, she had remained a quiet anchor within his family life. Kepler and Barbara had already endured early losses. Their first 2 children had died in infancy. But the next blow came with merciless speed. As Barbara lay weakened by illness, smallpox returned to the household. Friedrich, their only surviving child at the time, became infected. He was only about 6 years old, a boy whose eyes once lit up whenever his father pointed out a star or told stories of the planets. Friedrich died. A candle extinguished inside a home long accustomed to coughing groans and whispered prayers. Kepler could not grasp how a universe he believed to be governed by mathematical harmony could take his child so swiftly. And then before that, grief had even begun to settle. Barbara, exhausted by sickness and sorrow, could endure no more. She died in the summer of 1611, leaving Kepler alone in a house once filled with life, now inhabited only by wind and absence. In the weeks after Barbara's death, Kepler often wandered through the small garden behind the house, where plants withered beneath a veil of mist. The names of his daughter, his son, and his wife echoed through his memory. No measurement, no equation could bind them to his universe anymore. On the star charts, planets continued to move according to precise laws. But in Kepler's own life, the center of his private orbit had collapsed. It was a blow that struck not only his heart, but his faith itself. Kepler, who had used reason to decipher the paths of planets, now faced a reality no formula could explain: separation and death. The man who measured the heavens with equations could not measure the weight of loss within his own family. Those immutable laws suddenly felt powerless against the sound of grief and the emptiness left behind. Beyond his walls, Prague did not pause its turmoil. Emperor Rudolf II, once his patron, had lost both throne and authority. The Bohemian court sank into conflict between religious and political factions. Anti-Catholic sentiment intensified, while tensions between Protestants like Kepler and Roman Catholics grew increasingly fierce. Kepler found himself the target of rumors and suspicion even within scientific circles, especially after the new government of Matthias took power in Bohemia. Debates over astronomy, astrology, and religion were no longer abstract. Questions were raised about his use of celestial knowledge to predict politics and personal fate, forcing Kepler repeatedly to defend himself before skeptical officials. In those encounters, he felt like both a mathematician and a soldier, standing on an ideological battlefield he had never chosen. In this climate, Kepler lost more than his family. He faced an uncertain future. A scientist who had pushed back the boundaries of human knowledge now had to decide whether to remain in Prague or seek a quieter place to live and work. Prague, the city that had launched his career, now felt like a cold and precarious cage. No one could predict what Kepler would choose, but one thing was clear. Once again, he would have to leave. But before leaving the past behind and stepping into a new journey, Kepler made a quiet yet decisive choice. He remarried. In 1613, 2 years after Barbara's death, he married Susanna Ruttinger, a woman nearly 20 years younger than he was. The union drew little attention, yet it opened a new rhythm in Kepler's life. Not radiant, but warm enough to endure. This marriage brought more children, some of whom survived the waves of disease and war, and became the remaining fabric of his later years. Not everything was restored, yet after so much rupture, Kepler began another family chapter, one that offered both support and balance against the upheavals still ahead. To outsiders, the decision may have seemed practical. For Kepler, it was also an attempt to rebuild a small, fragile structure within his private world, even as the larger world around him fractured more each day. And so, with shoulders still dusted by astronomical ink and a heart only recently stitched back together, Kepler prepared to step into another journey. A journey of a mind that would not surrender to chaos yet, did not forget the human core within itself. Along that road, he would not merely leave a place behind. He would carry with him a heavy memory, like winter winds cutting through every layer of life. Chapter 10. The Music of the Spheres. Kepler left Prague with its weight of losses pressing behind him. Yet, in the bitter cold of Central European winters, his pen never fell silent. Linz, where he found a new footing after political upheaval, was both a temporary refuge and the launching ground for one of the greatest works in the history of astronomy. Harmonicas Mundi, the harmony of the world. Prague had been the capital of power and science. Linz, by contrast, offered the quiet Kepler needed to face the overwhelming numbers crowding his mind. The city lay along the Danube. Stone roads stretched beneath rows of leafless winter trees. Tiled rooftops gathered frost each morning. Everything seemed to mirror a soul shaped by loss, yet driven to uncover the order hidden beneath the universe's darkness. In Harmonices Mundi, published in 1619, Kepler began asking a different kind of question. Could the laws hinted at in his first two discoveries be extended further still? Was there a deeper structure, a hidden harmony, linking time and space, distance and rhythm, motion and meaning among the stars? Like a composer standing before a vast symphony, Kepler tested, compared, and repeated, calculation after calculation. He believed the universe obeyed not only geometry and motion, but harmony itself. That the planets were notes, that their variations formed a melody woven through the solar system. Then the third law revealed itself like a chord resolving scattered sounds into a single key. The square of a planet's orbital period is proportional to the cube of the semi-major axis of its orbit. What we now write is t squared proportional to a cubed. This was not a dry formula. It was a profound relationship between time and space, like a balanced tone resonating through the music of the heavens. This insight did not arise from sudden inspiration alone. Night after night, Kepler studied Renaissance musical scores in the Linz library, contemplating scales, intervals, and ratios. He searched for parallels between the progression of melody and the paths traced by planets. He believed there was a shared language between mathematics and music. And the third law was its clearest expression. Just as musical notes are arranged by rule and proportion, So too the planets take their places, each moving to its own rhythm in the grand composition of the cosmos. With 3 laws in hand, elliptical orbits, equal areas, and harmonic proportion, Kepler completed a picture that astonished his contemporaries and generations to come. Harmonices Mundi did more than pull astronomy away from the perfect classical circles of Aristotle and Ptolemy. It connected what had long seemed separate: mathematics, music, and the motion of the heavens. In its pages, Kepler wrote with unguarded passion and deep intuition. To him, the universe was a realm of proportion and harmony, where each planet vibrated according to its own note within a vast cosmic symphony. That harmonic relationship, now expressed through the 3rd law, allowed later astronomers to imagine connections not only between the sun and its planets, but between fields once thought unrelated, between music and astronomy, rhythm and space. At the same time, Europe was entering a new age of chaos. The 30 Years' War erupted, religious divisions deepened, and criticism of new science grew sharper. Yet within Harmonices Mundi, none of these storms seemed able to disturb Kepler's inner conviction that cosmic order could be found, that it could be read, and that, like music, it could be heard through the human mind. Like Bach, who could compose intricate fugues without ever performing them, Kepler was a composer of celestial music rather than a performer. He did not hear these harmonies with the ear, nor see them with ordinary sight, but sensed them through a mathematical intuition that reshaped how the world looked at the sky. And though Harmonices Mundi never became the most popular book of its age, the chords it revealed continued to resonate across centuries, from Newton to modern telescopes, as testimony to the universe's deep and poetic order. Yet just as Kepler seemed to glimpse a fragile harmony between cosmos and reason, the world below rose with very different sounds: harsh, violent, irrational. Not everything obeyed laws, and not every truth was heard. Chapter 11. My Mother is a Witch. The echoes of the night sky still lingered in Kepler's mind. The delicate laws, the harmonious orbits, the music of the world he had only just set down on paper. But once his feet returned to the ground, he was forced to confront a reality that did not move by laws at all. A world ruled by fear-envy and courts where rumor alone could become a death sentence. In 1615, while working in Linz, Kepler received grim news from his hometown of Leonberg in Württemberg. His mother, Katharina Kepler, had been accused of witchcraft. The accusation was brought by Ursula Reinbold, a neighbor with whom Katharina had shared a long-standing feud. The trigger sounded almost trivial. After a heated argument, Katharina had looked at Ursula with a strange expression. A few days later, Ursula suffered unexplained stomach pains. In a small, superstition-soaked community like so many villages in Central Europe at the time, that was more than enough to begin a trial. Katharina Kepler, now in her 70s, bore little resemblance to the witches of folklore, except for her age, her sharp temper, and her knowledge of folk remedies. Widowed early, she had raised her children alone in poverty. She lived reclusively and argued openly with neighbors. None of these were crimes. But in an age of fear, they were enough to justify a stake. Kepler, who had just completed Harmonices Mundi and believed he might finally return to astronomy after years of personal loss, was forced to put everything aside. Not as imperial mathematician, but as a son. And that son had to step into a place where reason held no authority. A court of the witch hunts. He did more than hire lawyers. He studied the law himself. He read every statute examined, every clause, wrote his own defenses, and exposed contradictions in witness testimonies line by line. For 6 years, Kepler fought relentlessly, submitting more than 60 legal documents to multiple levels of authority. It was a labor no less demanding than the years he had devoted to discovering the third law. The man who had once measured the distance to Mars now found himself measuring rumor, parsing ancient legal ambiguities, calculating every fragile margin between accusation and proof, all to save his mother from the fire. Katerina was imprisoned for more than a year. She was chained, interrogated, and repeatedly threatened with torture. At one point, the judges proposed the use of instruments to bring out the truth. Kepler immediately objected, citing legal provisions that protected the accused from torture, without evidence, a safeguard rarely invoked in witch trials of that era. He was not entirely alone, but neither was he fully supported. Many relatives turned away. Some of his own associates urged compromise. But Kepler, the man who sought truth among the stars, refused to accept half-truths in a courtroom. At last, in October of 1621, Katerina Kepler was acquitted and released. It was one of the very few witch trials in Germany to end in a declaration of innocence. Not through influence or pardon, but through argument and relentless reason. She did not live long afterward. Her aged body and a spirit worn down by years of imprisonment gave way only months after her name was cleared. Kepler left few direct statements about his emotions during his mother's trial. Yet scattered letters from that period reveal a deep inner struggle. He who could read the motion of celestial bodies through mathematics could not measure or explain the fear, hatred, and prejudice consuming the human mind. For him, this may have been the most painful paradox of all. Intelligence could redraw the heavens, yet remain powerless against the darkness within people. The battle to save his mother marked another summit in Kepler's life. Not in a laboratory, but on the cultural front lines of his age. He had won, but it was a victory soaked in tears, and it carried a stark reminder: the rational mind cannot stand apart from its own time. And then, as if gathering every loss and bitterness into silence, Kepler returned to his desk. Before him lay equations, orbits yet unfinished. But in his heart, he may never have understood more clearly the truth he had pursued all his life. That truth must not only be discovered, it must be defended line by line, even in places where no one believes in it. Chapter 12. Writing in the Shadow of War. As Kepler fought his legal battle to save his mother from accusations of witchcraft, the world beyond his immediate struggle was drifting toward another storm. A chain of political and religious tensions culminated in the defenestration of Prague. In 1618, two Catholic officials were thrown from the windows of the royal castle by Protestant nobles. The act became the spark that ignited the 30 Years' War, a conflict that would rage for 3 decades, devastating Central Europe with plague, famine, and relentless violence. In these conditions, Kepler, having just completed Harmonicae Mundi, and still carrying the weight of profound personal loss, did not lay down his pen. He understood that reason does not wait for peace to exist. It persists even in the darkest days, and it was precisely in those brutal moments that he continued to write, publish, and send his books into the world, as if resisting collapse itself, one manuscript page at a time. War was not an abstract idea fought somewhere far away. It arrived with the thunder of hooves and the blare of military horns echoing along cold stone roads. It appeared in soldiers occupying once quiet towns, in the fear of displacement and scarcity that seeped into everyday life. Linz, where Kepler had sought a measure of calm after his losses, was no longer tranquil. Armies passed through, alarm bells rang through the night. News of battles and outbreaks of disease spread, and the population withdrew into itself. Between 1618 and 1621, Kepler completed Epitome Astronomiae Copernicanae, a monumental summary of the Copernican heliocentric system and his own developments of it. This work was more than an astronomy textbook. It was a declaration that reason still had a place amid despair. Kepler believed that even if the world could collapse around us, there must remain stable horizons toward which the human mind could turn. At the same time, wounds within his own household had not yet healed. The deaths of his first wife and son still echoed through his days. In 1618, Kepler lost another young daughter, a grief that became a constant undertone during the long years of war. These losses drove him further inward toward books and numbers as the last remaining forms of sustenance for the spirit. He wrote not because the world was calm, but because it was breaking. In 1619, amid the brutality of war, Harmonices Mundi, the work Kepler had nurtured for many years, was finally printed. Within its pages, he presented the third law of planetary motion, that the square of a planet's period around the sun is proportional to the cube of the semi-major axis of its orbit. For Kepler, this was not a dry formula. It was proof of a profound mathematical order in the universe, a cosmic symphony that could still exist even as the world below was torn apart by war. Beyond astronomy, Kepler continued to write on optics and applied mathematics. He discussed Galileo's telescopic discoveries and laid the foundations for formulas describing motion and trajectories, even if he did not yet reach the full mechanics later developed by Newton. He applied mathematics to practical problems such as ballistics, cartography, and geography. This work was partly scholarly necessity, partly a response to a world in fragments. To apply mathematics to daily life in an age of chaos was to assert that reason still mattered. Kepler was not only an astronomer, he was a comprehensive thinker in an era when knowledge itself was under constant threat. One of his greatest projects during this period was the Rudolphine Tables. Named after Emperor Rudolph II, a former patron of science and the arts, the Rudolphine tables became the most accurate astronomical tables ever compiled. They were based on the vast observational data gathered by Tycho Brahe and crucially integrated Kepler's laws of planetary motion to calculate the positions of the sun, moon, and planets with unprecedented precision. Completing the Rudolphine tables was anything but simple. War repeatedly delayed printing. Paper was scarce. Skilled printers were hard to find. At times, soldiers entered printing workshops, threatening to destroy manuscripts outright. Kepler and the printer, Johannes Kepler, spent countless nights awake carrying the original plates to the city of Ulm to continue the work, fighting for each page as if every letter and every number were a soldier defending reason itself. So when the Rudolphine tables were finally published in September of 1627, it was more than a scientific achievement. It was a victory of faith in knowledge itself, standing firm against the devastation of war. The tables did more than chart the positions of celestial bodies. They included over 1,000 stars and introduced refined corrections such as atmospheric refraction and the use of logarithms, a major advance in astronomical mathematics. These tables became tools future astronomers could rely on to predict and verify phenomena like solar and lunar eclipses or the transit of Venus across the sun. They set the standard for 17th century astronomy and helped inspire the next steps taken by Newton and the rise of modern celestial mechanics. Living amid war and plague, Kepler nevertheless maintained correspondence with scholars across Europe. He shared observations, debated ideas, exchanged thoughts on calculations, and sent manuscripts to fellow thinkers of his age. The letters written during those dark years carry both knowledge and exhaustion. They reveal a man who had witnessed astronomy move from planetary laws to a courtroom battle to save his mother, now balancing numbers with longing for family. Those pages stand as proof that even when the world tears itself apart over religion and power, knowledge can still bind people together. Many scholars of the time saw Kepler as an outsider because he believed in a harmonious universe, even as the world around him fractured. Yet it was precisely his persistence in writing printing, debating with colleagues and sending books into the world that demonstrated his conviction that within any chaos reason can still cast light if one never stops recording what one sees. Kepler's mathematics were not used solely to calculate planetary orbits. They also measured loss and broken dreams, woven like complex equations through pain and hope alike. He wrote about the heavens not only for astronomers, but for a future world, one that would need clear laws in order to make sense of its own confusion. He did not know whether his words would survive in a world on fire. But he wrote anyway, because in chaos, faith in reason was the one thing that kept humanity from dissolving. And so as war continued to sweep across Europe, he kept sending his books out as if casting seeds into the wind, hoping that somewhere at some time they would take root. Chapter 13. Cast aside by church and academy. In the early 1620s, as the witch trial against his mother had finally closed, and Europe still trembled beneath the thunder of war, Johannes Kepler entered a period quieter and harsher than any storm he had ever endured. He was not attacked. He was not imprisoned. He was forgotten, not through public condemnation, not through prison or execution, but through silence. Kepler was no longer an unknown name. He was the author of Astronomia Nova and Harmonices Mundi, and he was completing the Rudolphine tables, the most accurate astronomical tables in Europe. Yet in everyday life, these achievements offered little protection, little stability, and almost no security. The academic world kept its distance. Patrons grew indifferent. And the Church, while not condemning him outright, remained deeply uneasy with his ideas. As a Protestant living within Catholic territories, Kepler had always struggled to belong. But his deeply personal theology, woven from intuition, symbolism, mathematics, and astronomy, made him suspect to both sides. He belonged fully to neither. He was not denounced as a heretic, but he was never invited to teach at any major university. The prestigious chairs at Tübingen, Heidelberg, and Leipzig were all occupied. And despite having uncovered the laws governing the heavens, Kepler lacked the social standing required to enter those halls. He had no noble lineage, no powerful network, no circle of devoted students to amplify his name. Instead, he survived on temporary contracts, delayed payments, and patience stretched almost to its breaking point. In Linz, where he settled after leaving Prague, Kepler still carried the title of imperial mathematician. But the title was growing hollow. The Habsburg court repeatedly postponed his salary. There were months when no payment arrived at all, years when he was forced to submit request after request, not as a scholar who had reshaped astronomy, but as a man pleading simply to be paid. This was the cost of standing between worlds. Kepler's letters from this period no longer carried the intellectual excitement of earlier years. Their tone had grown weary, practical, and at times bitter. He wrote about rent, about printing paper, about the cost of feeding a family, about borrowing money from friends just to survive the winter. The 30 Years' War made everything heavier. Universities closed or operated only in fragments. Patrons of science turned their attention to armies and fortifications. No one cared what path Mars followed when villages were burning. No one needed precise astronomical tables while plague was spreading. Kepler understood this, but he could not stop. There was a quiet paradox in his life at this moment. The further he was pushed to the margins of society, the more he wrote. Not because he was encouraged, but because writing was the only way he could continue to exist as himself. He pressed on with the remaining sections of Epitome Astronomiae Copernicani, striving to present the Copernican system and his own laws as clearly and accessibly as possible. He wrote about optics, about vision, about the refraction of light through lenses, studies that would later influence the design of telescopes. He also wrote on applied mathematics, measuring the volume of wine barrels, calculating ballistic trajectories, mapping land and geography. These tasks may have seemed trivial, yet they served more than survival. They reflected a deep conviction that mathematics must touch life itself, even when life turns its back on the mathematician. Still, despite his relentless work, Kepler never found a true academic home. He had no institute of his own, no research circle, no direct line of students to carry his legacy forward. He was a solitary figure working in a small room surrounded by the sound of wind, distant gunfire, and letters, whose replies grew ever fewer. At times, Kepler came to a bitter realization. His contemporaries did not yet grasp the full scope of his work. His laws were too new, too unfamiliar, too far removed from classical intuition. They were correct, but not yet useful to the majority. They would require another generation and another language before they could truly be absorbed. Kepler lived in that gap between discovery and recognition. He did not starve, but he lived in constant shortage. He was not persecuted yet, he was repeatedly forgotten, not condemned yet never protected. By the late 1620s, the fatigue of his body became impossible to ignore. Journeys in search of salary patrons and printers drained what strength he had left. And still, he did not stop. One final task remained, a summation of his life's work. The sky continued to move. The planets followed the paths he had drawn for them. And even as his wages went unpaid, Kepler held to one certainty: numbers do not betray. He did not know that what he wrote in solitude would become the foundation of a new science. At this moment he was simply an aging man, exhausted, yet still convinced that if the universe had order, then truth, even when cast aside, must endure. Within that empty space, Kepler continued to live and work as he always had. Quietly, patiently, faithful to what he had seen in the motion of the heavens. But time did not stand still, and the pressures of real-life money, illness, and war were slowly pushing him away from that fragile calm. Chapter 14. The Journey Left Unfinished. After the Rudolphine tables were published in 1627, Kepler allowed himself a quiet hope that at last some measure of recompense would come from those who had once promised it. Unpaid salaries from the imperial court, polite assurances of teaching posts or patronage, matters that sounded like mere formalities, yet could have given him a stable footing after years spent moving between intellectual labor and daily survival. He left Linz with what had become his familiar baggage: a handful of manuscripts, letters requesting payment, and a mind that never stopped turning toward the stars. But the world of that moment had little attention left for astronomical theory. The 30 Years' War had overturned everything. Patrons of learning focused on survival and security. Academies functioned only in fragments. In such a climate, bread and shelter mattered more than the laws of the heavens. Kepler was not disappointed. He simply understood that intellect and practical life often follow different paths. Between the two, he chose to remain faithful to both, to tend each page of his writing, and to worry quietly about each daily meal. In 1630, he traveled to Regensburg, where Emperor Ferdinand II had convened a major assembly of the Holy Roman Empire. Kepler knew this might be his last chance to directly request the payment of wages long owed to him by the court. This was not a plea born of desperation, but a straightforward step. He had devoted his life to knowledge. Receiving even modest compensation was a way of preserving the dignity of a scientist who had given everything to his work. Regensburg that autumn was filled with wind and fine rain. Caravan soldiers, merchants, and nobles crowded the damp stone streets. Kepler walked among them thin shoulders, carrying a lifetime of writing and calculation, his eyes still holding a determination that had not faded. He met with officials presenting letters, documents, and printed copies of the Rudolphine tables as evidence. He spoke of theory of the necessity of astronomy for navigation, of how numerical tables could help determine the positions of ships and the dates of festivals. His tone was calm, firm, without complaint. He sought only a place modest enough to continue living by the work he had chosen. But the times were unyielding. Officials delayed. They cited war-empty treasuries and crowded schedules. Kepler came to see that earlier promises now survived only as words on paper. He did not blame anyone. He simply felt what it meant to live among people absorbed by immediate realities where science once again had been pushed to the margins. During his days in Regensburg, Kepler rented a small room across from an old church. The wooden walls were worn with age, the window sometimes creaking when the wind passed through. By day he moved between offices and corridors of authority. By night, he sat at a rough wooden table under the faint glow of a candle, correcting loose pages of print, annotating long rows of numbers, line by line. He did not complain. He worked as though preparing for an important presentation, guided by a quiet conviction that every page, whether formula or note, still possessed its own worth. One cold, rainy day, Kepler returned to his room and felt a sudden chill run through his body. Fever came without warning, leaving him trembling through the night. The next morning, while the city was still veiled in mist, he tried to step outside, but his legs faltered. For a brief moment, his thoughts turned to the planets circling the sun with steady rhythm and precise distance motions. His mind had understood for far longer than his body now remembered how to stand. He returned to his bed and lay staring at the old wooden ceiling. There was no patron at his side, no students gathered nearby, only memories of pages already written and numbers still unfinished. He thought of the soundless turning of the heavens, of the astronomical tables he had sent to librarians and scholars across Europe, of the way light once seemed to flare on the page whenever a new law revealed itself. And in that half-dreaming state, he felt as though he were among the stars themselves, suspended in a realm of logic that never faded. On November 15, 1630, Johannes Kepler drew his final breath. He departed gently, more quietly than any journey he had ever made. There was no crowd at his bedside, no proclamation, only the cold wind outside the small window, a reminder that everything moves along its own orbit, just as the planets continue their silent paths around the sun. He was buried in a small cemetery outside Regensburg, near roadside grasses and wild growth. After years of war, the exact location of his grave was lost. Yet that loss does nothing to diminish what he left behind. The sky was no longer a realm of myth, but a domain open to human reason. Kepler died in silence. But the equations he wrote, the orbits he uncovered, and the astronomical tables he labored to complete continue to live within humanity's store of knowledge. For those who would later seek to understand the universe, his works are more than tools of calculation. They are reminders that perseverance and intellect can still cast light, even when the surrounding world is at its darkest. He did not stop walking until the very end. And that journey, though it did not end in glory, opened the path for every journey that followed. Chapter 15. The sky is no longer silent. When Johannes Kepler drew his final breath in a small rented room in Regensburg, no one knew that the universe had just lost one of its deepest listeners. No church bells rang for him. No bronze statues were raised. No public funeral marked his passing. Even his grave gradually vanished beneath weeds and the long shadow of war. Yet just as planets continue to circle the sun, whether anyone watches them or not, Kepler's legacy never stopped moving. The laws he left behind, born of solitude, scarcity, and an unwavering belief that the universe could be understood, began a second life after his death. The life of ideas. Only a few decades later, an English boy named Isaac Newton grew up in a world still unsettled by war and religion, but now equipped with Kepler's laws. They became the first iron rails on which he would build a new system, celestial mechanics. When Newton published Principia Mathematica in 1687, he did more than introduce the law of universal gravitation. He laid the foundations of classical physics, all resting on the elliptical orbits and proportions Kepler had once written down. Newton himself acknowledged it with quiet honesty. "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." And there is no doubt. Kepler was one of the strongest shoulders on which Newton stood, lifting his gaze toward the distant heavens. Kepler's laws became the foundation for every major advance in modern astronomy and physics. From the design of telescopes, to mapping the universe, to calculating the trajectories of spacecraft today. In 2009, nearly 4 centuries after Kepler wrote of the music of the planets, NASA launched a space telescope bearing his name. The Kepler Space Telescope was not merely a tribute. It was a continuation, designed to search for planets beyond our solar system. So-called Kepler planets, it relied on the very principles Kepler had first uncovered. Over more than a decade of operation, the telescope discovered over 2,600 planets, expanding humanity's understanding of the possibility of life beyond Earth. The dream of a living, harmonious, vast universe that Kepler once imagined was no longer a hypothesis. It became a research mission, a national project, a guiding goal for generations of scientists. The sky, once thought silent and perfect, had begun to speak. Kepler, a man who once had to beg for money just to print his books, who was turned away by universities for being too unorthodox, has now become a name etched onto modern instruments flying through space, drifting among meteors and asteroids. Before Kepler, the sky was the domain of gods, a place where humans prayed, assigned meaning, but did not dare to measure. After Kepler, the sky became a map, something that could be read, measured and understood. He never won prizes. He was never ennobled. He had no academy of his own, no large circle of disciples to carry his name. But he accomplished something few ever do. He changed the way all of humanity looks up. Perhaps in that final rented room in Regensburg, he believed his notes would be forgotten. Yet centuries later, from Newton to Galileo, from Einstein to NASA, thinkers have returned to Kepler, not only to learn from him, but to understand how a mind can outgrow its own age through faith in order and reason. Not everyone leaves footprints on the moon, but some leave the path that leads there. Johannes Kepler was one of those people. Quiet, uncelebrated in life. Yet the lines he wrote, the laws he uncovered, and the faith he held on to during his loneliest days became a compass for humanity's greatest dreams. The sky after him was no longer silent. It spoke in equations, in orbits, in radio waves, and in light, and in every modern map of the universe somewhere. There remains a faint, unobtrusive line written with his name. Kepler, brief, quiet, and indispensable. And here the story can come to rest. Not because everything has been said, but because sometimes listening to a certain point is enough. Johannes Kepler lived in an age of deep uncertainty. His life was not an easy one, yet he chose not to turn away when what he saw did not align with what everyone else believed. Perhaps in ordinary life we have known moments like that too. Something very small, a detail that seems unimportant. But if we ignore it, the mind finds no peace. And if we pause long enough, it begins to tell us what truly matters. If you are listening to this story now, as the day has come to a close, allow your body to rest. You do not need to remember the numbers. You do not need to hold on to the details. Just know this. There was once a human being who lived slowly, thought deeply, and chose truth even when it was not easy. If you would like to continue listening to real stories told at this unhurried pace, you are welcome to stay. With a follow, a like, or a short comment if something lingers with you. For now, let your breathing slow. Let the night do its work. And if sleep arrives, let it come naturally. May you rest peacefully tonight.